just remembered an actual paper.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Neil Almond.
Hello.
And Chris Such.
Hello again.
It's great to have you back, guys. And we're going to explore some unseen questions from listeners. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
This week I had reason to go back to a document that had an oversized influence on my career, something called Maintaining Curiosity by Ofsted from 2013. I read that alongside Ofsted's research review into science, which was from, I think, 2021, maybe 2022. No, 2021, April 21. The reason I went back to them was I wanted to check that my impressions of them were correct. And what I found was that, yes, they were. It's fascinating to read them side by side because both of them are by Ofsted. Both of them are making quite explicit recommendations around teaching. And in really important ways, they completely contradict each other. It's not that they slightly disagree or that there's nuances. They are saying very, very different things about the teaching of science. So Maintaining Curiosity, in effect, downplayed the teaching of substantive knowledge and said that, look, as long as kids are still interested in science, you're doing a decent job. The best way for kids to learn something and remember it for the long term is to learn it through a scientific inquiry, to discover it for themselves. I'm not paraphrasing there. They do use the phrase like discover it for themselves. And that is in complete contrast to what the Ofsted Research Review series suggests. Now, rather than pick apart the evidence that either of those use for their claims, I think it's just it provides a note of warning to anyone listening too carefully to what Ofsted has to say about pedagogy, because these things were published slightly over 7 years apart. They say completely opposite things. They undoubtedly had quite major effects on how people delivered professional development about the teaching of science and how people ended up being judged on the teaching of science in primary and secondary schools. And the fact that they completely contradict each other, as I say, suggests that we might need to be quite cautious in listening to those voices when it comes to teaching generally. What about you, Neil? What are you reading for?
So I read an article that I saw, or a research paper that I think I saw Kat Howard tweet it out. It's one you might be a bit familiar with, Chris. It's called Do Advanced Organisers Help Teachers Learn New Information During Online Professional Development, in which you are listed as a co-author on that particular paper.
Oh yeah, that was an interesting time. One of the joys of working for Ambition Institute is you get to work with some pretty cool people on some cool stuff.
So this was Chris, Sarah Cottingham, Stephanie Mellis, Sonal Patel, and Sam Sims. And I think the headline being is if you're doing online professional development, don't worry about creating a fancy online advanced organizer, because it doesn't look like it's going to be that helpful when compared to the group who didn't get one. So I'd be interested to see how Sarah thinks about that, because obviously she's very pro Alcibel, and obviously wrote a wonderful in-action book about the use of Alcibel's thoughts around advanced organisers. So yeah, very interesting. Obviously, doesn't mean that it's not useful for the classroom, say. I think I enjoyed the note about the resources being prepared potentially were so high quality that and I think it was about reading. So those everything else being so high quality that the advanced organizer wasn't needed really. So that was quite an interesting avenue to explore. Perhaps Chris could go on to explore a bit more of that high quality resourcing that was put in place for
Yeah, I mean, it was an advanced organizer that was used for part of the NPQLL that I mostly wrote relating to reading. I mean, just an important caveat about this research is that in order to try and create an advanced organizer that um, really strictly met the criteria of an advanced organizer, even though there is very little agreement of what an advanced organizer is, to try and create an advanced organizer that didn't just summarize the text or provide any information really about the text, we had to create something that was quite detached. So if you're thinking now that it's a bad idea to provide an advanced organizer that summarizes what your people are about to talk about, or that provides key notes about what you're about to talk about, this paper doesn't relate to that at all, because we had to create an advanced organizer that didn't contain really any of the content that it is an advanced organizer for. I know that sounds a bit bizarre. Check out the paper if you want to know a bit more about it. But yeah, I wouldn't, if you're thinking about advanced organizers to summarize and organize information that's about to be shared, this paper doesn't really address that as directly as you might think.
Anyway, I reckon there's a whole episode here for you, Kieran, a bit of a deep dive in this. We'll see if we can get Chris and Sarah and Sam and the others on and interrogate them on the nuances of this particular bit of paper. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
Wow. I mean, all the action in the first couple of minutes here. Those both could have been episodes on their own, and probably should be at some point. I think the whole point of this podcast is that we're encouraging people to think really carefully about their practice, and very rarely will we be measured by those of equal expertise, particularly in our field. And so, I think wise words, Chris, but hopefully for the regular listener, that just sort of adds to their confidence in their own ability to articulate why they do the things they do. And it's not because Ofsted or any other external body tell us to. So I think that's really interesting. And I also know that Sarah is really reflective. And so even if Chris is seemingly contrived and overly convoluted research is has shown Isabel to be lacking in some aspects, which it doesn't sound like it has. I know that she would review her stance on that and say, so it does sound really interesting. I reckon we try and get that sorted sometime in the new academic year. Now, my reading has not been that interesting, but it's show favorite Tim Marshall book called Divided, and it's about like how the walls that we've built determine. I'm gonna read it. So we're living in an age of walls. And it's fantastic because it looks at some of the major walls of the past and the present and outlines, I don't know, it's like a helpful summary of where we are in the geopolitical situation, because there are things about the sort of conflict in the Middle East and things that have happened since the sort of spring uprisings of 2016. And I think it didn't, to be fair, the book was written in 2017. So Donald Trump is mentioned a few times. He was still president then. Touch wood that's not the case whenever he writes his next book. But it's a perfect summer book because it's got enough information for you to learn stuff, but it's not so dense that you're going to go, oh, I need to be in a different frame of mind. So well worth checking out. This week, we're going to field some unseen questions to varying degrees of difficulty. Some of them have been emailed, some of them came through Discord, some of them maybe through X, but my X messages get checked less and less these days. The first one says, I've been asked by my LA to set up a work group for maths, and I'd like to suggest a paper to read for all the attendees. What would be a good paper to start off with, as I imagine they haven't read anything specific in a long time? If possible, a maths paper with relevance to primary. Thank you. And that's the easy one.
That's the easy one. Can I just reflect the question back to you, Kieran, and say that you tackle this one? Or can I even just subvert the question and say, maybe not a paper? So which is what I'm going to do anyway. I'm going to dive straight in, cheat, make it absolutely clear that I can't think of a really valuable paper off the top of my head. And through that, suggest The NCETM spines, look at the one relating to addition and subtraction, especially kind of, year 1 to kind of year 3. Addition and subtraction, multiplication, division. Look at those two, pick them apart. I think there are very few primary maths teachers, even those who have already read them, who haven't got a lot to gain by going back and having a look at those. No, it's not a paper. I know that's a cop out, but that would definitely be my answer.
It's interesting because this person teaches in a local authority in a different country. So it'll be interesting to see if they do take that advice and what impact that has on their teachers, because they're very unlikely to have used it or you be encouraged to utilize it within their setting. So yeah, I mean that could be one to follow up with this person in the future.
I won't cop out. I'll provide an actual paper. And it's called Developing a Sustainable Place Value Understanding by Moritz Herzog, Antje Elhert, and Anne-Marie Fritz. Now, Herzog has quite a publishing history of looking at place value, and obviously place value being such a sort of a cornerstone threshold concept for the later understanding of mathematics. I highly recommend this particular paper because it kind of builds on some of his earlier work in terms of trying to sort of not divulge, but sort of trying to find out if there is a sort of developmental trajectory of place value understanding. And this is kind of a synthesis of where he is so far. I think it's 2022-ish, I think. And yeah, it's a really interesting paper that I think would be worth reading because, if kids don't get place value by the time they're 6 or 7, then they perform mathematics rather than learning mathematics. And obviously that's not particularly good enough. So that title again is Developing a Sustainable Place Value Understanding by Moritz Herzog, Antje Elhert, and Anne-Marie Fritz.
Nice. I remember you mentioned that to me before. I'm not sure if it was on the podcast or not, but definitely one worth checking out. I mean, my go-to is always the Kira Carbonneau meta-analysis. I think it's called a meta-analysis of the efficacy of teaching mathematics with concrete manipulatives. I always have it as 2014, but I think it might have been published in 2012. And I think it was the first time I'd read a meta-analysis of maths research, or certainly mathematics education research that was pertinent to primary, that had a reasonable number of papers to draw upon, because they qualify what is valid, what's invalid, and then review from there. And this one, I think, was a reasonably sizable scope, and actually had some really interesting findings. So I would always check that out because, I always say that we need to be critical consumers of our sort of use of the information available on the use of manipulatives. And this is almost one of those papers that can really help with that kind of critical thinking, I think.
Just remembered an actual paper, and it's one that I would recommend. It's one that I've read quite a lot. 3 approaches to one-place addition and subtraction, counting strategies, memorized facts, and thinking tools by Li-Ping Ma. There's a book by Li-Ping Ma as well. Basically, it looks at the way that one-digit addition and subtraction is taught in some part of China, I think Shanghai, or at some point, compares it to America. It's a fascinating way to learn about the way that number bonds can be and should be intentionally developed. There's a lot of really good stuff out there, a lot of really good programs on number bonds that I think use that structure as a basis. So well worth checking out.
My cheat answer, if you don't want to read anything, then obviously looking at the Learning Trajectories website. Well, again, as Kieran has alluded to, it's an international listener who's asked the question. So the Learning Trajectories website is predominantly sort of lots of American-based research, but they have effectively provided sort of the trajectories of learning that pupils might go through various other aspects of mathematics. I think it's recently had a facelift, and it's free to use. You only need to create an account, and again, you could do easily a whole year of mathematical PD just by going through and looking at the trajectories on there and the type of activities that they suggest to bring about these sort of mathematical learning. So definitely it's Clements and Samara, is that right?
Sarama.
Sarama, there we go. Yeah. Again, they have an excellent book as well about chord learning trajectories, which is well worth a read. But say my cheat answer is the Learning Trajectories website.
Excellent. I'm sure that'll be really useful. Lots of great stuff. I mean, in fact, I wish I was in this group so I could start looking at this with these teachers who are sort of at this precipice. But hopefully the listener will let us know how it goes/has gone. Gets a bit more tricky now. This comes off the back, Chris, your The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading 2.0 episode in January-ish. And in the context of reading instruction, what's the best use of time when children are working one-to-one with an adult? This listener, I think, responded on Spotify and said they were looking forward to hearing more. I haven't gone back to check if we said there'd be more coming soon, and then it hasn't. But I thought I'd ask the question now that I remembered.
So it depends. I think it's one of these things that we can really overcomplicate, but it really depends what the pupil is struggling with. I mean, 9 times out of 10, if you are working one-to-one with a pupil on reading, unless they are in, say, reception year 1, maybe year 2, it means that they need extra support. And so it depends. I would say first and foremost, if this is a pupil that lacks the basic knowledge of the relationships between letters and sounds and how to use them, then in that one-to-one session, I'd be working on phonics, or at least an aspect of phonics. So say, for example, if their code knowledge was fine, but blending was a problem, or decoding polysyllabic words was a problem, then it's that I would be working on. So in short, if decoding's an issue, find out what aspect of decoding is an issue and do that one-to-one with the pupil. If it isn't an issue, then I think you can simplify things greatly, because if it isn't the issue, then odds are you're not going to find anything that is going to serve your purposes better than thoughtful one-to-one reading. Currently have a blog somewhere from about a year ago or so that talks about how to make the most of one-to-one reading. The short version of it is you hear the pupil read aloud, you model and give them feedback on any decoding errors, giving them the chance to copy you and then to have a go at it like down the line independently. You ask them to reread some sentences in order to build a sense of fluency, and you discuss the text. So in all of those things, you're developing fluency, you're developing motivation, and you're building their wider understanding of English orthography, and you are supporting their comprehension all in one. So in short, I think the most valuable things you can do are either focus on an aspect of decoding that they're struggling with, if they are. If their decoding is basically fine, but they are not particularly fluent, then one-to-one reading is the best way to go. I guess the only other thing I might say is that if, for example, we've got a pupil who has issues that have been identified by a Senko, and they suggest, well, actually, that time might be better spent working on spoken language development, then that might be the case because of the overlap between reading and spoken language. I'd say perhaps there's one other circumstance, it's a bit rarer, but if you get a pupil who is a relatively fluent reader aloud, and despite that, they really struggle with understanding text, then I would be likely to do something akin to close reading, where we'd be reading together and I'd be asking them to summarize, to think about what they think might come next in a text or a story, basically to think deeply about a text, think deeply TM. Sorry about that, Kieran. Like I'm sure the lawyer's letter's in the post. But to think deeply about a text, just to kind of awaken them to the idea that they need to be doing detective work, because very occasionally you do find pupils, often those with a quite literal mindset, who will have become relatively fluent readers without realizing that they need to meet the author halfway. They need to do that detective work. They need to resolve ambiguities.
So maybe I'll just explain like what not to do. Don't sit them in front of an adaptive assessment to try and pin down a particular area that the child is really sort of struggling at. Because the chances are, as the question alluded to, it's a one-to-one situation. And I think, Chris, you wrote a thread relatively recently about this. If you have the opportunity and you do have the time and the structures to have one-to-one or one-to-few, you listening to those kids will outperform any sort of adaptive assessment that you can do. Obviously, you want to make sure that they're there because of, let's say, actual like decoding or fluency reasons. If they're there because they've done a comprehension assessment, and you've had to do some sort of QLA and it's come back that their inferencing skills aren't particularly strong, then no amount of specific inference type interventions are going to make a massive difference. There's maybe something in terms of letting them understand how inference works, but beyond that, you're not getting any sort of benefits or gains from that at all, really. It's just then becomes general understanding of the world, and that intervention could go on until they leave school and would never stop. I'm open to being wrong, and this is just kind of maybe something that I've thought about, and Chris can jump in here, but if there's like decoding, then potentially not just getting them to decode, but if you notice that there's a sound spelling correspondence that they're struggling with, then perhaps just a brief little bit of spelling practice using those phonemes and graphemes would be quite a useful thing to do, because then they're not just having to then recognize those graphemes on the page, but they're actually having to retrieve those as well. But again, Chris could come in and say, no, that's absolutely not the best use of time, and I'd totally bow to his knowledge on that one, because it's been a while since I've delved into reading.
Oh no, you were happy to hear that. I absolutely agree. When, in particular, if I'm talking about, if someone's having a coding intervention, so a phonics intervention, like with the teaching of phonics more broadly, really important part of embedding a pupil's ability to blend is the slightly trickier reverse of that, getting them to segment as well. So where I've put together things like blending interventions, almost always a big component of that is segmenting as well. It's kind of spelling words. Obviously, segmenting and spelling are not the same thing. It's just that you segment when you go to encode a word. So it's a part of spelling using familiar GPCs. So I totally agree with that. I guess there's one other thing to build on there with that, idea of what we're going to do one-to-one is just, okay, how do you actually then decide what it is you're going to do? And that comes into what Neil says there. Adaptive assessments, online assessments, any kind of comprehension assessment isn't really going to tell you much beyond roughly where this kid is as a reader overall. You do have to hear them read aloud and potentially do some kind of decoding assessment, something like a previous year one phonics screening check is likely to help there, or a phonics assessment that comes as part of your phonics program, is using those to get a sense of whether decoding's the issue, or whether it's just that fluency is a problem, or whether it's neither of these things and you just want to work on that comprehension detective work a little bit. Those are the basic assessments that I would be using to kind of work out what was most effective.
Certainly, early on in my career, there was a narrative where if phonics wasn't working, and so interventions would then go to like sight word things. It'd literally be like, right, let's get the flashcards out and let's get them through those first 100 high frequency words. Although I found out quite recently there's like 13 words that every key reader needs to know, which is a bizarre bit of reading that I came across. But it's effectively, if you are having decoding issues with children, it can be easy, I think, to think, well, phonics isn't working, so you don't want to keep on doing the same thing over and over again and you get the same results, so we need to do something different. That might sort of, by then switching to a sort of a sight word or flashcard method, you might get some sort of quick seemingly gains, but that will very quickly sort of go off a cliff when they read more complex text. So I guess point being here is just, maintain that phonics stuff. Don't be tempted to try something else because, they've had phonics. Quite a common one you hear is that, well, they've had phonics for 6-7 years and it hasn't worked. Well, the chances are the quality of the phonics hasn't been particularly great if that's been the case, or they've not had ample opportunity to actually do a lot of practice. Where there are so many pitfalls on that journey that there's a lot of unpicking to be done before you need to think maybe I should try something else. And I would very rarely, I don't think I'd ever suggest you actually do go for anything else.
Wise words indeed. I mean, that one came through Spotify. Spotify have recently upped their comments game. It used to be you had to respond to a question. Now anybody can write whatever they want on the episodes. I mean, only 16% of people listen to us on Spotify. Apple's still the dominant force, no matter how hard Spotify try. But we'll see. If anyone is on there and they want a response to their question, it's now more likely because we've got that capacity to do so. So the next one, Neil, is probably more in your wheelhouse, but I remember, Chris, you asked me a question on an unreleased textbooks episode way back in 2021-ish. And you asked me about whether or not textbooks would go online eventually. And I'm pretty sure I said, no, I couldn't imagine a world where this was possible. And then obviously things have accelerated in terms of the use of technology. But what do you think will be the biggest shift in the use of artificial intelligence in schools in the next academic year? So that's 24-25.
Only in the next academic year. I don't think there's going to be any massive monumental shifts. I think more teachers will become aware of it. More senior leaders will consider possibly a bit of basic training in it, and undoubtedly teachers will find it useful for some things and not very useful for other things. I remember again early on in my career trying to find the perfect image for setting descriptions. Well, that's now a thing of the past, and that's quite nice. You can take children's setting descriptions or character descriptions, put them into a large language model, and it will spit out the picture, and you could almost use that as a bit of fun bit of self-assessment. Does this look like what you thought you described? And if not, what do you need to change? But there's not going to be, I don't think, any sort of massive monumental shifts. I just think people are going to be using it more. Schools will either embrace it or they will try to put a stop to it because of all the data harvesting that are taking in getting LLM outputs involved, unless you have a specific educational or enterprise account, which obviously some schools will have, some schools won't have. So it's still in its infancy, and it's important to remember, even though this is an area I'm particularly interested in, not many schools and teachers are sort of using this on a regular basis if the teacher tap data is anything to go by. So the next year I think it will just kind of keep on flowing. More people will get used to it, more people will see it, hopefully more people will subscribe to teacher prompts, and we'll get that readership up a little bit.
I have to say, I assumed when I learned a bit about AI, and I know nothing about it basically. The only stuff that I do know comes from Neil's emails. So actually, I know a little more than nothing, thanks to him. But I did kind of expect there to be more issues around June, July, as people were using them to write reports. Because that's the first thing that comes into mind for me. If you think about how often when you were writing reports, you're like, you know what? These two kids, they are remarkably similar. I am going to use quite similar. Obviously, I would never. Yeah, no, I did do that. But these two kids, they're basically similar. I'm going to take what I wrote for that kid and just adapt it a little bit to personalize it, because some schools you're writing 1,000, 2,000 words per pupil, and it's absurd. And I just kind of assume there's got to be some teachers out there that have been using AI for their reports, and I just kind of assumed there'd be more mistakes and accidents that would go viral as a result. Either teachers haven't caught on to the idea that this might be useful for reports, or AI is just so good that the parents aren't spotting the inevitable errors that slip through the net.
I don't think any of my kids had an AI generated report. I mean, you can sometimes tell by some of the language that gets used, and sometimes it makes stuff up as well, doesn't it? You know, sometimes for a lot of our copy, you know, if it's not important and it just needs to be in there, we'll utilize, you know, what would you say in this situation kind of thing. And then it'll just make stuff up, you know, and I might as well have just spent the time writing it myself. What about the use of HTML, Neil? I saw Stephen Enigmailed on TikTok talking about how he made a Google app or like a what are they called? Plugin? Google plugin? Now, in my mind, you could ask a reasonably decent LLME, LME, is it double LME? No, it's just LLM. Oh, for God's sake.
Just LLM.
LLME is a local leader of mathematics education. That's why.
One of the same, really.
Yeah. You can ask a fairly decent LLM. I mean, like not Copilot. You can't even ask it what day it is. But you can ask a decent one to write you the code, and then you can almost give them like multiple choice questions that mark themselves and stuff, and give you the data. Do you think that's something teachers will branch into, or is it because it's just a little bit beyond the technological reach of most of us that actually that's not going to happen?
I think that's pretty specialized, and again, you know, I have or know people who are coders, and some say, yeah, do you know what? It's really interesting how it codes, but you still need to go and sort of, you know, change things around. And I got, you know, no idea how to do any of that stuff. So even if you did try to get your large language model to code you a little application, I think there'd still be a fair little bit of work that you would have to do and have that knowledge to fix up or change or whatever it might be. So yeah, perhaps the computer science teachers at secondary might develop something if that's where, you know, where they've come from, or teachers who have a bit of a interest in coding. But certainly, I don't think anything as specialized as that. So playing around with a little bit of Claude where you can just say, oh, I want to be able to move this interface and I want to be able to reorder certain things and make sort of very brief, quick little games like that. But again, that's still in its infancy, and I don't think that's that's more in the 3 to 5 year line. I think not the immediate term.
All right, last one's from me. It feels as if our new government have made a pretty decent start in terms of education and beginning to tackle some of the key issues. And so it feels like things are going well. It feels like it could be a reasonably positive shift in schools as we move into the next 4 or 5 years. What am I missing? Where could it possibly go wrong?
Well, there's some curriculum and assessment reform coming down the road. I think they want that finished by next year, I think, end of next year, maybe early 2026. And so far, the language of the current Labour government has been positive in terms of it's not going to be a massive rewrite, which is obviously great. Schools in the last 5 to 7 years put a lot of time into developing their curricula, so it will be good that it's not a total say rewrite and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm personally still praying that Roman numerals remains in this new curriculum, that we might find out what it is. But assessment will be an interesting one as well. Obviously, Key Stage 1 SATs disappeared. I can't see a Labour government deciding to bring those back in. Will they look at maybe anything to do with Key Stage 2? Maybe there's something there to do with the way that reading is done and maybe a bit of writing as well. Again, not for next year, but you know, I think we'll get to the point where scanning in student responses with a rubric and with some sort of data of what a good one looks like, what a bad one looks like, could do a lot of our sort of summative assessment. So that would be an interesting one, instead of having to do continuous moderations, because we all know how useful that practice is. So yeah, I think there's some interesting things on the horizon around curriculum and assessment, which, you know, will keep an open mind, see what happens, and not in the corridors of power anymore. My my associates that I do know and have talked to previously, they obviously aren't in the current government, so I've got no sources and no sort of leaks I can provide to you, Kieran, I'm afraid, on this one.
There are potential pitfalls. I think the obvious one is, but well, again, if you own a hammer, you see every problem as a nail. So, as someone who's interested in reading, I see every potential problem on the horizon as relating to literacy. First, I slightly worry about the possibility of moving to teacher assessment for year six reading because of the flawed nature of reading comprehension assessments, which are used in at the end of Key Stage 2 SATs. I do worry somewhat that there'll be a push to move towards teacher assessment, which is never the panacea that people think it's likely to be. I'm certain it would increase workload. There'd be lots of problems with that. I worry about. I'm a worrier, so I worry about any kind of pushback that comes against the teaching of systematic synthetic phonics. I do think that the phonics screening check has been and continues to be a useful lever. Whether it still needs to be in place, I think there are good arguments either way. Personally, I'm cautious enough to think it's sensible to maintain it. But yeah, primarily I worry about people pushing back against the need to teach systematic synthetic phonics. And more importantly, alongside that, there could start to be a potential creep back into the profession of things that sound nice, things that have nice names like balanced literacy that actually mean, well, some kids deal with words by looking at the relationships between letters and sounds primarily, but some kids, we want them to just kind of work them out from context only. Sound spelling correspondences or grapheme phoneme correspondences, they can be a bit of a last resort. As long as you get to the word, it's fine. And, I and many others have seen the detrimental impact that kind of teaching has on pupils down the line. So, yeah, slightly worried about some voices becoming prominent within education again, but I don't think that's likely. I've had no reason from what I've seen online and from what the government have said to suggest that is likely. It's merely the fact that when power changes hands, there is always a great opportunity for things to change in a positive or negative direction. I'd say the final thing, and I feel a bit. It's probably not my place to say this. I haven't worked directly in a single. I've not had a class on my own for a couple of years now. I don't have to deal with the pressures of classroom teaching and teaching the curriculum, etc. But my impression is that if you said to schools right now, okay, we're going to tear up the national curriculum, or we're going to make vast changes to the content in science and history and geography, etc., I do not think that would be welcomed by the majority of classroom teachers and school leaders, though I think it might be cheered by certain people who are a bit more distant from schools. So I worry slightly about vast changes to the national curriculum. Again, no reason to think that that's necessarily coming, but yeah, hard not to worry about these things.
No, it was pretty promising to see what was on the criteria or the agenda for the review. And then obviously having Professor Becky Francis involved, or at the helm, should I say, is obviously a really positive move, I think. So I'm less concerned there. I mean, obviously, because, I think you're absolutely right, Chris. If curriculum becomes a big thing on the agenda, teachers are going to be a bit perturbed that actually it's SEND and funding for SEND. And is behavior the other one that schools are talking about, and what happens there? So those are almost like the two things at the top of the agenda. And then you've got things like school buildings, which have sort of been kicked down the road for a long time. And so I hope they get the focus that they need. Now, Sam Friedman, if I've interpreted his book correctly, he talks about how the fact that DfE have ended up with more to do than they can physically cope with, and more things that local government used to do. And I know that there was an announcement about the devolution of greater powers to local councils and things, and people could opt in. Do you reckon there's a world in which we move closer towards the DfE having the capacity to focus on those big things because they're not dealing with sort of things that are more trivial and should be dealt with elsewhere? I don't know. Does that world exist, or are we going to be in the same place in 4 or 5 years' time?
I mean, I like to think that that's top of their agenda, that grasping the nettle around things like the system relating to SEND, alternative provision, etc. That is like then that and because you talked about that and behaviour, and I think obviously those two things are intimately linked. And for those working in schools, it's they talk if they talk about one, they talk about the other. So grasping the nettle on that. We remember talking about at the time about the unfortunately large initial investment that would be required to get ahead of these issues, to start dealing with things earlier in a child's education. Um, it kind of reminds me of something that I like casually say every now and then, which is that, you know, if the Department for Education, if the only thing that they did, if they touched nothing apart from doing that and maybe installing air conditioners in schools, if they only did those two things over the next decade, everyone would love them. You know, everyone would be delighted. And even with all the you know the things that we could personally pick apart, the flaws that we see in the national curriculum or assessment or whatever it might be, if they just tackle, I mean, obviously one of those is much bigger than the other, but if they just did those two things and worried about nothing else, everyone would be delighted. So I think there would certainly is room for the DfE to focus more on these, you know, big ticket items for a while rather than curriculum and assessment. But I guess we won't know whether that's, you know, likely to be the case until we see the results of the curriculum and assessment review.
A positive to look forward to will be what, you know, they want to put a lot of support in the early years and kind of really kind of tackle things earlier, involving language and literacy. I think at one point the plan could have potentially have been to get Nelly in, which is the Nuffield early language intervention. I think there was sort of scope of looking at getting people trained up in that to deliver that in every school, which would only be a positive thing. I'm not quite as firsthand as I used to, but certainly the schools that I work with at STEP, the new reception intakes, you know, is difficult in terms of the lack of language development there, and so, you know, there's no point. And when I say formal education, I don't mean sat in rows, but in terms of reception being the first sort of year of legal education, you know, children aren't ready for that yet. So doing something like that would be useful. They're also interested in doing something with regards to early maths, but very small on the detail of what that actually entails and is. So, you know, things to be potentially, you know, positive about.
Yeah, I mean, there was obviously that old article about the phonics of maths. I don't know if that's resurfaced recently or not, but there was some part of the pre-manifesto conversation was that there would be a phonics of maths implemented. And I thought we could do an episode on what that actually should mean. Because obviously you've got all these different elements, and we can't just say that there are certain things that, you know, I think it has to be criteria based in terms of, are these things actually the building blocks in the same way that letters and signs are, as opposed to Mastery Number 2.0, because Mastery Number, as far as I hear, or as far as I hear, does a pretty good job already for those schools that are utilizing it. So yeah, it'll be interesting. But I do hope that, yeah, I'm not proven wrong, because it feels like a really positive, you know, start to the first 100 days. And we'll see where we are in 1,000 or so days. But it should be easy to hold them to account via this podcast, because I know they'll be listening every single week without fail. Fantastic. So it's been great to see you guys. We've got our 3 or 4 podcast episodes there that we've just all unofficially agreed to. So I'll be sending you links to those calls over the next couple of weeks, because you didn't really want a summer holiday anyway, did you? No. Thank you very much to everyone who sent questions in. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.